So, this lecture will cover the social psychological underpinnings of racism. This will be a relatively short lecture. Last time we talked a little bit about the behavioral and the attitudinal dimensions of racism by differentiating prejudice and racist ideology on one hand from individual and institutional discrimination. We are mostly going to be focusing in this class on on structure and on culture as drivers of the patterns that we see specific to race and ethnicity. But it's useful to have at least a little bit of a sense of the underlying, again, the internal cognitive processes that are part of this, even though this is a sociology class, not a psychology class. Um, the concepts that are going to be really important to us are the concepts of schema and to a certain extent frames, as well as stereotypes and the way that stereotypes reflect a kind of biased organization of information. So let's start with schema. All of these are learned, by the way. So all of these kind of tendencies either are acquired through socialization, or they are an amplification of a tendency that might be a little bit on the more innate side, as we'll see with schema here. So schema refer to internal cognitive structures. They are essentially structures that exist in our minds that allow us to organize information that we gather about the things in the world around us. They are learned, as I mentioned, though the tendency to organize information does seem to be somewhat innate. Not to go too deep into the weeds, but there are some basic predispositions, things like apophenia or pareidolia, that seem to suggest that we are born with a tendency to kind of organize information that exists in the world outside of us. So apophenia is the ability or the tendency to see data, or patterns, I should say, in data that is random. Pareidolia is a very specific kind of apophenia in which we can see human faces represented in non-human objects. So, we might look at an electrical outlet and see two eyes and a mouth, or we might look at the front of a car and the headlights and the grille suggest a face. So, those tendencies do appear to be kind of built in, but what happens is we learn structures and we learn these schema that kind of are reinforced and build off of that innate tendency. So the information that comes into our awareness through our senses is what we call sensation, right? So light and sound and touch and smell and all those other things. That is how information about the world around us comes into our awareness, right? Through one or more of our five senses. But that information, when it travels up into our brains, is in essence decoded. It is categorized, right? So it's put into a variety of conceptual categories. That's what we mean by schema. That also then provide us not just categories, but meanings, right? And this is kind of where frames come in too, right? So frames kind of work in a kind of a slightly larger way. These are sort of systems of schema. But frames and schema allow us to perceive, identify, and label events and occurrences. And so if we have, say, for example, a frame built around, let's pick one from outside of race and ethnicity just to not muddy the waters any. Is heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is a frame in a number of different societies in which the unconscious assumption about the nature of human sexuality is that we are by default heterosexuals. That is not, I want to be very, very clear, that is not settled, right? That's just a supposition. There are a number of theorists out there who have suggested that that's an incorrect set of assumptions. I mean, very famously, Freud argued that when we're born, we we're sort of indifferent to the sources of gratification, right? We're what he called polymorphously perverse. We just like feeling good. It's its own reward. We don't really care what makes us feel good. Feeling good is the thing that we're after. Um, and you'll see little kids will put their feet in their mouths. They'll touch things. They'll taste things that parents are like, stop, don't do that, right? And that's the establishment of boundaries. So when people are born, they don't have a default sexuality. But what happens is, as kids grow up, males learn in this society that the appropriate sexual object choice for them will be female. And females learn that the appropriate sexual object choice for them will be male. In other words, heterosexuality is learned behavior. It's not the default condition for human sexuality. Again, I'm not endorsing Freudian theory. I'm saying that this idea that heteronormativity represents an accurate read on the actual nature of human sexuality is far from settled, but it is a dominant frame within our society. And what that means, of course, is that then things get interpreted through that lens. So imagine you're walking down a hall at Harper and you see a man and a woman having a fight in the distance, right? You can tell they're having a fight because you can read body language and facial expressions. You can't hear what's being said, but you see visually what looks to be a fight. And the assumption that you might make, quite unconsciously, is that that's a couple having a fight. And you get up close enough to where you can hear what's being said between the two of them. It is indeed a couple. They are having a fight, and you're not remotely surprised. And usually we don't even realize we're not surprised because we don't think that we had an expectation as we approach that couple. But if it were two men having a fight or two women having a fight, we probably wouldn't assume that they're a couple. We might assume a number of other things might explain why they're having a fight. But when we get close enough to hear them and we hear that they are indeed a couple having a fight with each other, we might react kind of quietly, but in a surprised sort of way and say, wow, I didn't expect that. And it's in that moment when you realize you had an expectation. Right? It's only when a frame gets violated that we realize that the frame was there at all. And that's because that's what frames do, right? If you go to a museum, if you go to a museum, modern art. You're walking through the galleries, you're looking at the paintings, right? The way you know what's art and what's not art is what's in the frame is art, and everything else is not. This is why some displays in modern art museums can drive people nuts, right? You walk into a room and over in the corner there's a chair with a broom against it, and on the floor around the chair are a bunch of Snickers wrappers, and you're like, is that the art? Did the janitor forget to clean up, right? It's kind of hard to know because we don't have the frame to kind of render an interpretation of what we're seeing in a way that clarifies, whether or not this is in fact art or not. So when you're looking at a painting, like a conventional painting inside of a frame, you almost never notice the frame. It's because the frame is only there to direct your attention to the thing that you need to focus on. And so cognitively, that's what a frame does. A frame inside our minds helps us to organize information that we're taking in from the world around us. And it does it in such a way that we aren't even aware of the frames. We're just aware of the perceptions that are flowing out of our interpretation of that information, to the point where we don't even know we're interpreting it, right? And that's why these things are, again, unconscious. You really have to be... you have to be jarred more often than not to even recognize that you have a frame. This would be sort of like Berger's notion of a shocking discovery would certainly help to sort of create a disjuncture between our assumptions and what we're seeing, or the exposure of an inconvenient, our exposure to an inconvenient fact, something that undermines what we previously thought was true. Most of the time, because the information that we're bringing in is consistently interpreted with the existing schema and frames that exist in our minds, we don't even realize that we were predisposed to seeing the world in a particular way. So one of the ways in which this plays out in terms of race and ethnicity is through the persistence of what we call stereotypes. Now, a stereotype is just a kind of mental shortcut. In the case of people, right, it's an exaggerated belief that is assumed to be true of a category of people. So the belief that anyone or almost anyone inside a particular group is going to have a particular characteristic. That's the essence of a stereotype. And again, not particularly or not universally bad. I shouldn't push this point too hard, but I do want to say, in defense of stereotypes for a moment, that as mental shortcuts, they're very, very helpful. If you're approaching somebody that you've never met before, but you are going to have an interaction with them, it's really important that you have some initial cues that will guide that interaction. This is a concept that Lynn Laughlin, who's a qualitative sociologist, back in the 70s called categoric knowing. So we talk to old people differently than we do young people. We talk to men differently than we talk to women. So being able to sort of put people into those categories and assume a couple of things are true about them because they're in those categories does give us some important initial resources for the interaction that's going to unfold. What tends to become problematic is when we can't let go of the stereotype, even as we get more information that gives us a better picture of this person than just the stereotype that we had of them in that initial interaction. That's when stereotypes become very dysfunctional, when they serve to persistently organize the information that we have about a person, even as we get more and more information about them. So in those instances, the stereotype becomes what we call a central organizing trait. That's a quality or an aspect of an individual that has the greatest impact on the impression that others form of us, right, or that people form of them. So when racial or ethnic classification functions as a central organizing trait, it becomes the lens through which everything that person does or says gets understood. I do research on homeless people. And when homelessness is the central organizing trait, then everything you do gets kind of interpreted through that lens. And the presuppositions, the schema and the frames that are built around our understandings of homelessness actually serve to shape the understandings of everything that unfolds inside that interaction. There was a guy who panhandled down in the South Loop area who would walk up to people and he would say, and these were mostly young people, college-age students, because you've got a bunch of college campuses down there, Robert Morris and the School of the Art Institute and Columbia College and all those places. So he'd walk up to these people, usually in their 20s, and he would say, look, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm homeless. It really sucks. I just want to get something to drink. Can you help me out? And these people would say, well, I don't really like the idea of this guy going and getting drunk, but he's being honest. So here, I'll give him some money because I value honesty, and he's being honest. And then, of course, he would take that money and he would buy a bus pass. He would pay rent on his single room occupancy hotel. He would buy food, right? He'd do his laundry. He wouldn't buy alcohol. He wouldn't buy drugs. He was a recovering addict. But he found that when he would tell people, hey, I'm homeless, but I don't drink, I don't use drugs, I just need money for a bus pass, or I just need money to do my laundry, nobody believed him because the assumptions that they had about homelessness were so powerful. And he was so clearly identified as a person who was homeless that everything he did and said was kind of filtered through that lens. So he lies to people and is rewarded for his quote unquote honesty. And when, of course, he was honest with people, they assumed he was lying. So that's the way that a central organizing trait operates. So when your central organizing trait is your racial or ethnic identity, then what people assume to be true of that racial or ethnic group is immediately understood to be true of you. And that's why it's important to kind of have those concepts in our conceptual toolkit as we try to think about the ways in which people try to overcome some of the perceptions or misperceptions that are built around race and ethnicity in a given society. All right, so that should give you guys a little bit of a set of resources to think about when you're trying to understand race at the level of social psychology. If you guys have any questions, of course, feel free to ask. And until then, I will say good night.